Thank you. This is the initial meeting for the Norwalk. The Norwalk Charter Revision Commission. This is an organizational meeting for us so that we can discuss how we get started and how we can best have a timing and a date that works for the majority of us to be able to participate. So I am Patsy Brescia. I am the chair of the Charter Revision Commission. And with us and present, we have members on Zoom, and we have members present here in the council chambers. So Rick McQuaid is vice chair of this commission, and he's present. And Tyler Fairbairn is present here, and on Zoom is Carl Dickens and Benita Raleigh. Is that what you want? Raleigh or Watford Raleigh, apparently I have to say. So we do have a quorum present and we can proceed. I have asked the chairman, the president of the city council, Tom Livingston, to join us tonight to just try to introduce to us the importance of this commission and the intent that the city has in asking us to help us to review the commission, the charter, and suggest any possible changes. So I'd like to ask Tom Livingston to just make some remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Brescia. And first off, I want to give a big thank you to all of you for agreeing to do this. This is a monumental and Herculean task. I probably could have told you that beforehand, but then you might not have done it. But it's an incredibly important task. It's a task that many of us in the city have been talking about for a long time. In fact, the charter was first adopted in 1913, and many of the articles remain as it was originally written. There has not been a comprehensive revision of the charter since its adoption, so more than 100 years. The charter is difficult for citizens to understand and contains provisions that are no longer applicable to current city operations. There are also references to conditions and structures dating back to the time when the city was just a town, elected positions that have no current function, and position descriptions with duties that no longer apply. And when I first brought this up at the council meeting, I noticed some examples, and I think they're kind of useful just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So the current charter provides for the mayor shall, quote, be the conservator of the peace of the city and shall have the authority with force and strong hand when necessary to suppress all tumults, riots, and unlawful assemblages, and to arrest without warrant and order, to be held in the city prison for a period not to exceed 24 hours upon information any person who may be detected in reveling, quarreling, brawling, or otherwise behaving to the disturbance of the public peace of said city. That's the mayor. The council has been given authority to purchase necessary fire engines, hose carriages, horses, and other fire apparatus at the expense of the 4th district. They have the power to regulate the speed of animals, vehicles, and cars in the streets, and they have the power to regulate coasting, sliding, and use of velocipedes, bicycles and tricycles on the sidewalk. So as you can, these are just small examples, but I think it's representative of the task ahead of you. And that is to bring this charter up to date, to make it usable and understandable for the average citizen. And to that end, the council purposely gave this commission broad authority to look at all aspects of the charter. We did not give you, as they did in 2016, 4 discrete questions to look at. We are letting you look at all aspects of the charter. But I have to say, given the nature of the current charter, just updating and modernizing it may well be all that you can do at this time. But that alone would be a great benefit to the city. In terms of the composition of the commission itself, we selected all of you to represent the city. We know you have diverse backgrounds and broad range of experiences. We have both Democrats and Republicans, and I'm happy that Mr. McQuaid has agreed to be vice chair and Patsy is chair. we asked, and I think all of you agreed, that no one was coming with any set agenda as to what they wanted to get out of this commission, other than to revise the charter for the benefit of the citizens of Norwalk. And I have every confidence that you will be successful, and I and the other members of the council are ready to help in any way we can. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. That helps to add a little humor to our task, I'm sure.
Well, it's going to be a long task.
Hopefully we have more opportunities for that. I didn't introduce our council, and I thought, Tom, you might mention it, but the city also engaged legal counsel.
I can speak to that.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so back in, well, the city has retained attorney Stephen Mednick to assist in this process. We did this because we know it is a very big job, and we wanted somebody who has the experience revising charters. Steve, as he will tell you, has been involved in charter revisions across the state. He knows the ins and outs of all the city charters, and he will be the first to tell you that he has held up the Norwalk Charter as being an example of essentially what not to do, or or as a, I don't know, I hesitate to put words in your mouth, but a bad charter. And Steve, I first met Steve, back in November of last year, Steve, or December, when yeah, Steve invited me to be a panelist on a commission, charter revision in Hartford, I believe, where he had brought people from different councils across and board of reps across the state to advise the charter revision in Hartford. And what I learned is the way that Steve does this very methodical way in terms of bringing experts together to advise the commissions. But I also learned about Steve, and that's how we got in touch. And I brought him down to talk to us. He spoke to the council. We were very impressed, and I think he will be a tremendous asset to get this job done.
Yeah, so, we're grateful to have Steve on board. And you talked about our charter, and when I introduced myself to Steve on the phone over the last week or so, we got talking, and I started laughing and recalling that as a student and government major at UConn some decades ago, my government teacher said there's this community in southern Connecticut, Norwalk, which has the most confusing and convoluted charter in the state of Connecticut. So that was my introduction to Norwalk some many decades ago. So we laughed about that, and so we'll see what we can do to make that better. Is there public participation? Is there anyone that had signed up?
Nobody out this time.
Okay, all right, thank you. So we'll move on to Attorney Mednick, who is going to start the process for us.
Thank you very much. Do you have my PowerPoint in
Yes.
the
we
system?
just-
So will somebody run it, or do you want me to run it from here?
Steve, you could run.
Okay, so share screen. And let me get this up on the screen. Does everybody see it?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Wow. So I'm not the mechanical moron that I think I am. So here we go. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Mr. President, members of the body. It's always fun to be at a first meeting when everybody is fresh and doesn't know what really lies ahead of them. But this is I've done about 30 of these around the state, mainly of the large cities, and Norwalk is one of the charters I've looked at. I don't know if I will say that it's bad, but the chair's professor is absolutely correct that it is convoluted, and we'll talk about that as we go through this little program that I prepare for new members of charter commissions. What I'm going to try to do in this process, and I hope it's early in the day, so hopefully you won't fall asleep during this charter, and I hope that I won't engage in reveling, knowing that the mayor has the power to throw me in the local prison if I revel too much. I'll try not to. But what I want to try to do is walk you through I'm just trying to get this, make sure that this works. There we go. Is to walk you through a number of things. So I hope the screen has home rule. A misnomer is the question. I'm going to talk about home rule because that really is what we're going to be working with for the next 10 months or so, is the home rule process, how that works, what it means, and how that applies to your constitutional document. And that's what you need to think about, is you need to think about the charter as your constitution. It is. When I started doing these in the 1990s, my hair was not white, but I used to talk about charter processes being white wig events. They're basically your local constitutional convention where a body comes together to try to improve the charter, to make it readable and linear so that members of the public and elected officials and town officials, employees, can pick up this document and understand how the budget process works, how the ordinance creation process works, how boards and commissions are supposed to operate, how departments are supposed to operate. Basically, all of the engines that operate the city should be in a document that is comprehensible, that people can understand. But I want to start off by talking about home rule for a while and get a few concepts down in terms of what it means. I call it a misnomer. I know that's a question, but my answer would be, yes, it is a misnomer. It's a term that sounds self-evident, and it means a lot of different things to different people. Some believe that it evokes the concept of local authority, local control, or even the term sovereignty. And you'll find out in a few minutes that some of those things are true, but sovereignty is clearly not true. The words are not what they appear. It's a term that is rife with ambiguity and misunderstanding. So what is home rule? About a year ago, the State Commission, Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations undertook a drafting project. They asked me to draft a definition of home rule for them to try to come up with something that was direct and readable. And I spent some time in the General Assembly before the GAE, the Government and Elections Committee of the General Assembly, to really talk about what home rule means. And the reason that the commission, the ACIR, wanted to do this is they wanted to really make sure that people on both sides of the aisle in Hartford and throughout the 169 municipalities in the state of Connecticut understood what home rule means, so that we can establish kind of a meaningful approach to home rule in the 21st century. We're almost through the first quarter of the 21st century, so it's about time that we did this. And the legislature right now, once the election is over, is going to be conducting a massive review of Title VII, which I'll talk about in a minute, that will help communities throughout the state grapple with the issues of home rule. But the story of home rule really begins in a time just after the Civil War with something they call Dillon's Rule. Not Matt Dillon, not Bob Dylan, but Judge Dillon from Iowa, where they had a case that came down in the post-Civil War era that really established the concept of what municipal powers are, how they work. And what the ruling held, and these are important principles that you really need to think about, dramatically think about, things you've never thought about before, even if you have been an elected official or a board or commission member, is to understand that municipal corporations, and that's what we are, is a municipal corporation, only has the powers that are explicitly or expressly granted to them. So you need an express grant of authority from the legislature. And I'll repeat that again many times in this presentation. They need to be necessarily or fairly implied in or incident to the powers that are expressly granted. So there is no inherent power. There is no implied power, only those powers that grow out of those that are expressly granted to a municipality. And they also need to be essential to the declared objects and purposes of the municipality, not convenient, but indispensable. And so let's point out right from the beginning that local government has no inherent legal or sovereign authority. Dillon's rule has been institutionalized and nationalized by a Supreme Court case in 1907, where the Supreme Court basically said that all sovereign authority in this country is either in the United States or in the 50 states throughout the United States. Only federal or state governments are sovereigns. And so we get our authority from the sovereign state of Connecticut. So let's look at the state of Connecticut and how the Constitution over the years in Connecticut has addressed home rule. We had the Constitution of 1818, which was in existence through the 1960s in the state of Connecticut. And the Constitution was silent on home rule. There was barely any mention of local government in that document. When you think about it, and you think about the history of town meetings that we've had in Connecticut, which is a New England concept, you won't find that in Iowa or Missouri or California, but really a New England concept. Our Constitution was silent on something that we thought was so inherent and so critical to the lifeblood of our communities, our 169 communities throughout the state. As you know, you're the product of an amalgam of towns that came together to create the city of Norwalk. So through the 19th and 20th centuries, our towns were granted special acts by the General Assembly. And you will see in your charter, and I've done a reorganized version of your charter, which I'll hand out in the next couple of weeks, you will see that most of your powers in your charter are still wedded to the special acts that were granted in the 19th and 20th centuries to the city of Norwalk. And in the 1950s, in the late 1950s, many of you who've been around for a while will remember that we had a county system in Connecticut. We never had a metropolitan government system like they have in New York or other places where the county governments actually were full-blown government entities, but the counties did have significant government powers. But after 1957, with the Home Rule Act, the General Assembly began the process of moving away from special acts and started to develop in Title VII of the general statutes, the powers that are granted to municipalities. I won't dwell on it this evening, this afternoon and this evening, but we will see throughout this process how that works. And again, those municipalities only have those powers that are explicitly or expressly granted by the General Assembly. And those are found principally in Title VII, although you'll find them in the Board of Education titles in Title X, the taxing titles of the statutes, as well as the planning and zoning statutes in Title VIII. But again, there is no inherent local legislative authority, and I underscore whatsoever, in Connecticut and in most municipalities and most states throughout the United States. We're a legislative home rule state, which means that the General Assembly grants those powers to us directly. So the concept of home rule, the Home Rule Act, was to get away from the special legislation so that a city could, through a charter, adopt its powers, adopt its form of government, the structure of its government. The only two absolute requirements in a charter are to have an executive, in Norwalk, that is the mayor, and to have a legislative body, which in Norwalk is the council. Everything else we do in the charter is really local choice, but again, choice within the constraints of Title VII. But as you'll find out in this process, the provisions of Title VII are fairly broad in terms of being able to give you a strong and clear set of rules for your local government. So the concept was to allow a municipality to adopt a home rule charter, and I'm got a quote here from the Supreme Court, which shall constitute the organic law of the city, superseding its existing charter and any inconsistent special acts. The 1965 charter, which constitution, which was the last major revision through a convention of the Constitution in the state of Connecticut, was where they actually created Article 10th, which is entitled of Home Rule. So that constitutional provision permits the General Assembly again to adopt general laws to delegate to municipality such legislative authority as the General Assembly deems appropriate relative to the powers, the organization, and the form of government of our political subdivisions. However, that broad language, again, broad but constrained, has limitations. The General Assembly reserves under the Constitution the right to continue to approve special acts, and from time to time, municipalities seek those special acts. But the Constitution really was the beginning. The Constitutional provisions in 65 were really the beginning of the regimen of law that we operate under today, with what I describe as a limited and circumscribed delegation of authority. So home rule is really an artifice. It's a construct for the orderly operation of government under the sovereign constitutional and legislative authority of the state. Again, at the risk of repetition, but I don't think I can repeat this enough, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. There is no inherent authority for self-government in Connecticut because the capacity for governance is derived entirely from the authority of the sovereign state of Connecticut. The important principle to understand, and this is where a lot of municipalities make mistakes, and I'll give you an example of it in a moment, is that silence is not authority. Because the General Assembly is silent, let's say on gun control, for example, does not mean a municipality with a lot of shootings and incidents with guns has the capacity to regulate guns. And I found this out as an alderman in New Haven in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that we had no capacity to address that issue because there was no express grant of authority. We tried to look to zoning as a justification, but it didn't fall into the case law in Connecticut. And therefore, without that express grant of authority, we had no ability to move in that direction. Another example, these always come up. I almost guarantee you when we start getting interactions with the public, people will want to talk about term limits. Some people are going to want to talk about recall of elected officials. I argued the recall case at the Supreme Court when I was a young lawyer in the 1980s, Simons versus Canty. But under that principle, there was no authority for recall in Connecticut. That's explicitly determined by the Supreme Court. Although there are 5 towns in Connecticut, 5 municipalities that have recall because they were granted recall rights in their special acts, and they retained the recall acts that were granted to them by the state of Connecticut. This came up more recently because a lot of communities want to have term limits on elected officials. Again, while there's no Supreme Court case on it, the same analysis that we had in the Simons versus Canty case applies to that case. And so I told you I would tell you about the silence is not authority anecdote. When I was doing a charter in Middletown a year and a half ago or so, I gave them the same spiel that I'm giving you today about authority. And at the next meeting, a member of the commission said, "Oh, Steve, we found out that Wilton has term limits." And we also found out later in one of my seminars that Tom participated in. I had a mayor in one of my communities say that she had it in her town as well. And I decided I represent the Western Connecticut Council of Governments. I called Wilton and found out about their term limits, and the first select person and the lawyer, the town attorney, both said to me, yes, we know it was adopted. We don't know why it was adopted. We don't have a special act. And they said, maybe you should call the chair of the Charter Commission. He is a lawyer. And I happen to know who he is. I called him up at his office in Hartford one day. And I said, so how did you adopt this provision? And he said, well, the state laws were silent, Steve, on the subject. And we just thought we could do it. And I pointed out, he's a very fine lawyer, but he doesn't do home rule, that is not the basis for an enactment. We need to have an express grant of authority. So you may see from time to time a community, as we get into this, I'm sure some of you will be curious and start to look at different charters, to look at different provisions. But when you see something that they have in their community, something that I've said you can't have normally, the question you're going to have to resolve is there a special act that allows it? Or what, do they have a chair of a commission who thought that silence was consent or assent? The truth is, again, silence is not authority. We are creatures of the state. Judge Dillon came up with that notion, basically said that we are creatures or creations of the state. And I often say that it sounds like he was paraphrasing Mary Shelley, who wrote the great Frankenstein books, when he said that state legislatures breathe into these municipalities the breath of life without which they cannot exist. As it so creates, so it may destroy. And that is the reality. It's a great quote that really sums up how home rule works. Basically, the legislature can grant us authority. The legislature can remove authority. It very rarely does remove authority, but the important part is the grant of authority. And that's a point that I will never step away from trying to underscore, as you'll see in the next 2 or 3 pages. So what are those expressive grants of authority? We have the authority to establish the structure of government. I just went through a cycle with one of my towns where they did examine different alternatives. Do they want to move from an RTM system, which they have now, to a town manager, a council form of government, or a mayor council form of government? So we have total flexibility to take a look at that issue of structure. I'm not sure we'll get to that in Norwalk, but what I think we need to look at in Norwalk is to make sure that the charter accurately reflects the mayor council form of government. What are the powers of the mayor? How does the mayor operate on a day-to-day basis? What are the legislative powers of the council in terms of the structural issues that they have? We also have express grants of authority with regard to the functions of government, how you create a budget, how you adopt laws, how you adopt resolutions, orders, how do you transfer funds in the budget? How do those things work? What is the role of the mayor, the legislative body in your town, in your city? We also have the Board of Estimate that comes into play that has some substantial authority in the area of budget and financial control, which is the next item that we do have express grants of authority with regard to the fiscal well-being and the fiscal structure of a community, establishing the budget, establishing the tax rates, bonding funds for major projects that we have. As I've gone through your cycle, as I've gone through the current charter, you have over 100 pages of provisions dealing with your taxing districts. And as you will see, there's a lot of recitation of special acts dealing with borrowings in the charter. We don't need to get special authority to bond any longer. So in new charters, you will never see the bond issue of 2011 issued or the bond issue of 2020 recited in your charter. because you have that general authority, because we have the express grant of authority to deal with the fiscal issues in our community. Then finally, in terms of express grant of authority, we have the ability to hire personnel, to have a workforce that works for the community. And one of the important things that you need to keep in mind as we go through this process is, again, Title VII has a section called the Municipal Employee Relations Act. And under the Municipal Employee Relations Act, the rules dealing with collective bargaining with our employees are firmly established in that section. One of the things that is very important to recognize, we may see it here, we probably will see it in your charter. I haven't analyzed it closely enough to know that at this point. But in most charters, you have, for example, rules regarding discipline. In the current world, a lot of communities look at the discipline of police officials, for example, and the police misconduct issues throughout the state of Connecticut. A lot of charters have provisions on how you file complaints against police or fire, any department. How does a citizen file a complaint if they have provisions of that nature? And those are in charters. But since MIRA, the Municipal Employee Relations Act, was adopted, you have collective bargaining agreements that also address those issues. And I've had most difficult debates I've had in public. We had a police shooting case in one of my communities where I had to explain to the public when they were saying to me, Attorney Mednick, in this charter, it says we can file this complaint. We can bring a complaint that could lead to the termination of a police officer. And I said, yes, that is correct. But we also have to see what the collective bargaining agreement has. Because under law, under the Municipal Employee Relations Act, the collective bargaining agreements have the force of law. And that collective bargaining agreement, which is ultimately approved by the legislative body, negotiated by the mayor, approved by the legislative body, has the force of law and can serve as a charter amendment in effect, or an ordinance amendment. If the collective bargaining agreement has a provision that differs with the provision in your charter or differs with an ordinance in your community, that charter provision or that ordinance are trumped by the collective bargaining agreement. So what you see in your charter is not necessarily what the law is regarding that particular aspect of government. I'll give you a more simple example of that. When I was elected to the Board of Alders in the 1980s, eager young alderman in New Haven, we had twice a week garbage collection in our charter. It was a charter mandated service, twice a week garbage collection in the city of New Haven. And about a year into my tenure, all of a sudden, we went down to once a week garbage collection. And I said to somebody, I called the mayor's office or the public works department, and I said, why? I did not vote to reduce garbage collection. It's in our charter. We can't eliminate garbage collection. He said, well, if you were on the Board of Aldermen last year, when we approved the public works contract, you would have voted in favor of reducing garbage collection to once a week in the city of New Haven. Most alders who I served with, who served that year ahead of me, did not know that was there. They thought they were voting on wage increases, pension increases. They didn't look at the fine print, which eliminated an important service to the people of the city. So it's really important to understand that interrelationship. So in a lot of the charters that I've been doing in the last decade or so, I make it clear in the charter that the rights that are set forth in the charter are subject, obviously, to state law, federal law, and collective bargaining agreement. It's really important that the public understands that, and it's very important that council members understand that when they're approving collective bargaining agreements. Again, we have this issue of local control and authority. We can have local control with limited authority. We have local control to the extent that we have authority that's set forth in our charter. So within the context of your charter, so long as it's not interrupted by a collective bargaining modification of your charter, you have local control in accordance with the provisions of that charter and state law. But as I said a moment ago, you can have a municipality that has authority to establish disciplinary structures, but we can also have limited control because we may have ceded that control through collective bargaining. And again, as I said before, I spent a lot of time with legislative bodies, acquainting them with the fact that they need to look at these collective bargaining agreements as they're coming through in their very short, as Tom will tell you, 30-day window where they get to approve or disapprove a collective bargaining agreement. And keep in mind, if they disapprove the collective bargaining agreement, it doesn't necessarily go back to the bargaining table. It goes to an arbitrator, mediator and arbitrator for final decision, which kind of cuts the local control element out of it. So, we need to underscore that issue and understand that issue. So, but the charter is your blueprint for governance, even to the limited extent that it is granted to us. And as I said before, it establishes two mandatory requirements. And what you want to make sure is that you have accountability for the chief executive official, that in the administration of government, that the lines of authority for the mayor are very clear, delineating his or her ability to conduct the day-to-day operations of the government with a level of accountability to the public and to the legislative body. And you want to have oversight functions for the legislative body that clearly tie into their ability to adopt ordinances, their role in the budget process, the financing of government, and into the oversight of the executive. As we approach charter revision, Tom talked about this a little bit, there are several goals in charter revision. One of them is you want to have a document that is clear so that the public officials who work with it, the public that is lobbying and asking for services to be granted should be able to pick up this document and read it and understand what their rights are and what the limits of authority are within the town government. You also want to have a document that's flexible. A lot of charters are very highly stratified documents that kind of constrain the ability of local officials to operate. You want to make sure that you have a charter that is flexible. And I'll give you one other example, and I think we'll get into this this year in this charter revision. I like to see charters that are light on the structure of your government. What do I mean by that? Some charters lay out every department, the fire department, the police department, the public works department, personnel, or human resources, and civil service, and all the departments, human services, and that's fine in a sense. But when you get too prescriptive in terms of the qualifications of a health director, the qualifications of a public works director, or a police chief, or a fire chief, or the finance director, you get yourself in a conundrum where the restrictions on their qualifications are so constrained that it limits your ability to search for people and bring people into town. It could be something as simple as you have a residency requirement and somebody can't afford to live in Fairfield County. It could be a constraint on a specific qualification. Just went through this in one of my communities. There was a time where people thought that a public works director needed to be an engineer. There was a time where the statutes required a public works director to be an engineer. There was a time where the statutes required the head of the public health department to be a physician. That is gone now. And so my general view on this is there are certain departments you may want to establish and have their functions clear so that you can't eliminate them, but you want to be careful about too many constraints on the actual officials. And so to me, the ideal charter would be a charter that says you shall have departments to deal with protective services, and you include those services there, fire, police, centralized services, the services that run the government, such as purchasing, personnel, those types of functions, finance, those functions. And there are specific things you were going to want to grant to a finance director that should be part of the Constitution in terms of what the finance director can do with transfers and things like that. But you want to try to keep it relatively fluid so that the mayor and the council can in real time, through ordinance or budget, make modifications to take into account changes in the way we live, changes in the way we conduct meetings. The meeting we're conducting today would not be a legal meeting under a lot of charters because there was no provision for these types of electronic meetings. So a lot of my charters in the last several years, even pre-pandemic, but certainly in the pandemic and post-pandemic period, have made massive changes in the way we notice meetings, the way we conduct meetings, and things like that. And then the same is true with boards and commissions. I talked about departments, but my view on it is similar with boards and commissions. A couple of exceptions. Hartford has an audit function. You want that audit function in your charter. You want it mandated in your charter. You want ethics mandated in your charter, because you don't want a mayor or a council that wants to be a little more pliable with some of those rules to eliminate those types of entities. So there are entities that you will want to put in your constitutionalize and place in your charter, but as a rule, you want to maintain flexibility. And the last point is accountability. And that goes to the ethics, that goes to auditing, that goes to functions that really are oversight functions. The last point I usually make on this page, but I've created its own page for, is you want to avoid a culture of disregard or paralysis. You want to make sure that your charter is unambiguous so that it will be followed clearly as a governing document. I remember in the 1980s, 90s, we ran into some problems with charter provisions, and we had a corporation counsel who was a very well-regarded lawyer. I ultimately, when I became corp counsel, named our library after him because he really was exalted, but he was also very imaginative. And in order to get around provisions of the charter that were very difficult to maneuver, he issued an opinion basically saying that wisdom and good judgment require us to disregard this provision. You should not have a charter that would allow, that would force a corporation council to issue the kind of opinion where they have to really spend a little time reading Alice in Wonderland in order to make the charter work for the people of your community. And I point that out because when you look at the current charter contents in Norwalk, this is the breakdown of the current 23 articles of your charter. It's all over the place. You have some departments that are created in the charter. Others are created within these sections. I want to point out this is not comprehensive. You open up your charter with the taxing districts, which isn't really a matter that addresses the day-to-day affairs of the city. It may be the day-to-day affairs of the districts to the extent that they have day-to-day functions, but you're all over the place in this charter in terms of the way it is organized. And it highlights some departments, some commissions, and ignores others. We will probably find out, I don't know if there is a parking department in town today, and I can't tell you whether the pension provisions that are in Article 21 apply to anybody working in the city today. But I'll tell you this, in Hartford this year, after 4 charters I've done in Hartford, 20 years of charter revisions I've done over the years in Hartford, we finally moved their ancient pension provisions to a separate volume They still didn't want to they didn't want to eliminate them because there might be somebody from World War I or World War II that a provision of the charter still applied to. I don't think there are any from World War I, maybe World War II, but we moved them out into a separate volume so that it didn't get in the way of the public looking at this document and understanding what's in the document. So that's a kind of a broad look at what your charter looks like today. And I think that the chair asked for the charter to be distributed. I know that you have links to the charter. You may actually have the hard copy in front of you. Since I'm not in the room with you, I don't know that you do, but that's what you'll find in your current charter. And so my analysis of it is you have, again, 23 sections and 197 pages in the charter. 63 pages are that you open up with when the public first looks at your charter are sections that deal with the taxing district. And you don't get to the government until page 73 of the charter. The council is in Article 4. There's also provisions of the charter in Article 15, all over the place. The mayor, you don't get to the mayor until page 97 of the charter. And the budget is in a lot of different sections, Article 5, Article 6, Article 12. So you don't have a provision in your charter where you can see this is when the estimates come in from a department, and this is when the budget is finally approved. And so we need to take a look at the charter, as the president has indicated, because all the elements may be there. We may find that many of the elements of your day-to-day operations are somewhere in that document. What we need to do as a charter commission, and to hopefully bring to the voters a year from November, is a charter that clearly delineates those processes, those protocols, those structures in a way that is understandable, comprehensible, et cetera. The charter needs to be reorganized and updated to reflect the operations and structure of the government. And what I don't have on this slide is, and also to allow your elected officials to, from time to time, make turns and modifications without constraint. They need to have the constraint of process that's established for them that allows for accountability, allows for public interaction, but they should have the ability to modify the way the government operates in order to reflect the necessities of a 21st century government. And so I'll give you a first look at kind of the structure that I want us to think about during the course of the year. And it doesn't have to follow this directly. When you see the document that I will send out to you, probably around the time of the public hearing or right after it, you'll see that I break it down into kind of the legal aspects. How do you construct the charter? Article 1 normally has definitions. In the modern charters I've been working with, I've tried to come up with a common language so that when a member of the public sees the term, for example, majority vote of the council, they know what that means. And you don't have to redefine it every time you use it in the document. Notice, public notice, meeting notice, hearing notice, those become defined terms, and you have the flexibility to establish notice provisions that have to be consistent, obviously, with freedom of information laws, but don't necessarily have to be as circumscribed as we will probably find them to be in your charter. A lot of charters require newspaper publication for notice. In the 21st century, notification on websites could probably suffice to assure that the public sees documents that are provided with maybe a small notice provision in a newspaper indicating where the ordinance can be found, when the public hearing will take place, those kinds of things. The second part, Article 2, or the incorporation, against legalistic things. Article 3 tends to deal with elections, electors, terms of office, other provisions that may apply. I've been putting in those provisions ethics standards, uh, disciplinary standards for department heads, elected officials. Obviously, we can't do recall, but you can have other disciplinary provisions for elected officials. Those tend to go into Article 3 in a lot of my charters. Article 4 tends to be the legislative body, the common councils, the common council provisions. How does a bill become a law? Basically, ordinances, resolutions, other legislative actions, orders, and the like. The next section usually deals with the mayor's powers, veto authority, appointment authority, his side of the appointment authority. The legislative body usually has an approval authority in many communities. Article 6 deals with other elected officials, town clerk, city clerk. Article 7 tends to deal with boards and commissions. What I normally recommend are general requirements, including how do you create a board or commission. You may also have boards or commissions that are specifically mandated in the charter. In the current charter, in the main titles, you have, I'm sure some of these boards exist. The Board of Estimate, we know exists. I don't know if the Tax Commissioner and Board of Relief still exist, but it's still in your charter. I'm sure you have a planning commission or planning and zoning commission, police board, fire board, and a fireman's benefit fund. I don't know if that last one still exists in the form that it's in the charter, but there may have been a collective bargaining agreement that has trumped that provision of the charter. So you may have boards and commissions that you do actually mandate in the charter, but the main portion of that provision should be, how do you create a board or commission? And then leave it to the mayor and the council to create boards or commissions to meet the times we live in. Tyler Fairborn, I know from working in Bridgeport, and during that period of time, there was nothing in the charter on resiliency, but in the first part of this century, Bridgeport and a lot of other communities started moving in the area of resiliency. And so why not have more flexibility to allow for boards or commissions to be created to reflect the issues that we deal with. The same is true in Article 8 with departments and department heads. The next articles usually deal with boards of education. There's not a lot in the Board of Education section, usually the structure of the Board of Education, usually cooperation provisions to make sure that boards of education are held accountable to the extent they can be. And there's an awful lot of accountability that you can have with a Board of Education, more than Board of Education lawyers will allow you to understand, but we'll talk about that as we move in that direction. I usually have a separate section on budget, on public funds, borrowing, and finance that clearly lays out the beginning and end of the budget process, how that works. You have referendum provisions. I assume it's more or less a referendum in response to ordinances that are adopted, or maybe budgets that are adopted. We'll take a look at those sections and we'll see where they will end up. You have some historical provisions that I've placed in the document, and I move the taxing districts to the end of the document because, again, the taxing districts are not central to the day-to-day operation of the local government, except to the extent that they may be from time to time. And we'll take a look at that as we go through it. But that's kind of the structure that we look at. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what we're going to be doing after the public hearing process. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And so it's the scope of the enterprise. Tom talked about the broad authority that has been granted to the Charter Commission. It's broad authority, but again, we have about a 10-month window to get things done. And so as we begin this process, we need to take a look realistically at what it is we can do, and we'll have a better sense of that after our public hearing, and a better sense of that after we meet with the mayor and members of the council and other people who are in government to talk about what they think the priorities should be. Once we go through those meetings, the charter then will establish, the Charter Commission will establish its real work agenda in our meeting schedule. Again, we start at the next meeting with a statutory public hearing. I will keep you up to date. Hopefully I'll have some staff to work with on this. I try to plot every item of public testimony by subject, so that we can, as we establish our priorities, can make sure that we've taken into account those items that the public has brought to our attention. And I usually annotate those so that we keep in mind who presented them, that the issue, when did they present the issue, and during the process, we go back periodically to see whether we have actually addressed those issues. The following meeting would be a meeting with the mayor, council, and local officials that I alluded to. The meeting after that is a critical meeting, what I call the red line exercise. My hope is that that meeting, I will have an opportunity, along with the city, the corporation council, to sit with you and go through the document, probably the reorganized document, because I think it makes sense, as when you see it, I think you'll understand what I'm talking about, to look at it from the first chapter to the end of the document, first article to the end of the document, to get a sense of what the potholes are and what the problems are. The reason I use the corporation council as an important player there is the corp council is the one who interprets this document and will know where he has faced challenges in the document. So we want to make sure, as we leave that session, that we understand that those are issues that we add to the scope of our enterprise to make sure that they are addressed, so that those are not problems in the future. Again, in terms of defining scope, we want to make sure that that people will understand the functions of government. We also want to address the issue of micromanagement or constitution. And what I mean by that, well, I flip to the next page, but let me talk about that for 1 second. If you take a look at at your next door neighbor in Stamford, they have a very heavily codified charter. While it's very organized and well organized and sensibly organized, I think it's too heavily codified, which again takes away from the ability of local officials to make decisions in real time that can allow you to pivot as you need to do from time to time in government. And so I don't think charters should be micromanaging documents. I don't think they should be guides to everything you do. They should be broad constitutional guides to how you do it, how the ordinance is adopted, how the budget is adopted, how the bonds are, how the bond issues go out from time to time, how you change the departments, reorganize the departments, reorganize your boards and commissions, et cetera. And again, all of this is a tricky assignment. Again, I'm going to repeat it this may be the last time, that there's no inherent or implied powers, no sovereign powers, that we have to look to Article 10th of the Constitution and to Title 7 of the general statutes. Again, as I said earlier, we have to look at the impact of collective bargaining agreements and recognition of those agreements and reference to them in the charter, so that when you get into a sticky situation, the public can't say, well, your charter says this. Why can't the council do this? Why can't the mayor do this? We need to make sure that people understand the full context of the charter and the full context of the operations of government. Again, charters versus ordinance. What I mean by that is what I've said before: charters as the Constitution, ordinances as your day-to-day governing laws of the community. Let's talk about the process. The council in the last few weeks has created the commission with 2 resolutions, 1 creating the commission, 2 appointing all of you lucky souls to be on the commission. It's not viewed as a partisan activity. There are restrictions, and your body reflects those restrictions. Not more than a bare majority of the body could be of one political party. I've mentioned the public hearing process. The charter process begins with a public hearing and ends with a public hearing. I very strongly recommend strong public comment components throughout the charter process, if not at every meeting, at least at every other meeting, that you open up the meeting with public comment on the subject matter that the commission will be dealing with during that period of time. After our second or third meeting, we will develop a work plan that will carry us through, it's not really August of 2022, it's really going to be October of 2022 through May of 2023. We then, when we're finished, after our last public hearing, the commission will propose a draft report to the council next May, presumably, or even June, depending on schedules. We're going to have to work with the council carefully on that, so that we can figure out and talk to the leadership. How much time do they really need? Do they need the full 60 days they're entitled to? If they don't, we may get a few extra weeks out of the process at our end. When they consider the charter at that point, they can approve it and end the process and then put it on the ballot, or they can come back to the commission with a series of questions and recommendations. I won't get into all the rules of how that works, but at that point, all you can address is that which the council has given to you. You then have up to 30 days to consider their recommendations, and then you report a final report back to the commission, the council, where they have 15 days with their own hearing. They have to conduct their, they have 15 days after that point to take into account the changes we've recommended, and and then they can either approve it in part or in whole, disapprove it in part or whole, and they create the questions and put the questions on the ballot for the following, for the election in 2023. We have to submit the questions to the Secretary of State's office the first week in September, and then the election will take place in November of 2023. This is, I won't get into a lot of details here because I kind of did already. This is the process that we'll be following from the organizational meeting where we're at today, to the public hearing, to our meetings with the mayor, and then our working meetings. And then we execute the work plan between the work plan and then the calendar from May to July of next year, or June to July, or even early August of the final steps in the process that we'll talk about as we get closer to that process. There is a newspaper publication requirement. With any luck, the legislature will change that because towns are getting a little tired of spending $15,000 or $20,000 to publish the charter revisions, which is what it costs in newspapers. It would be just as easy to do it online, but that is the process. And let's talk about my role. I'm here to provide legal advice. I will be working closely with the Corporation Counsel throughout this process. The Corp Counsel deals with this document every day, and I want to make sure that I don't ignore any of the cultural issues, the folk waves, as the political scientists talk about Congress, that really are different from town to town. So while I have a vast understanding of how these documents work, my knowledge of the culture of the community, I do develop a sense of it as I'm going through it, but I don't have, it's not ingrained in me. So I work very closely with the Corp Counsel. I deal with leadership of the legislative body throughout the process. I also do research and preparation. You'll find for most of our meetings, I will provide you with a lot of comparative data so that you can get to see if we, let's say we're working on the budget process, I will show you how budget processes work in cities and towns of similar size to Norwalk. I'm not going to show you a budget process for Roxbury, Connecticut, or Woodstock, Connecticut, which are town meeting towns. You'll see budget processes in Stamford, in Danbury, Waterbury, Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, Middletown, other Hamden, Connecticut, other communities that are similarly sized. and have similar governments as the government you have. I also try to provide facilitation of the meetings and interactions with the members of the body. I work principally through the leadership. But when I'm talking about these, again, the way I met Tom was through what I call the seminars, the fact-finding panel discussions that we have throughout the process. So I'll help facilitate that process by inviting in speakers on the subjects that they deal with day to day in the process. I want to make one last point, because I've referred to the institutional figures, the Corporation Council, the mayor, and most importantly, the body, the council. The mayor statutorily has very little to do with the charter process. But the mayor is the chief executive of the community. And so I work very hard to make sure that we interact with the mayor's office, particularly as we're looking at departments and we're looking at processes to make sure there's a comfort level, because you want to have the mayor buy in to this charter process, because while the mayor doesn't have a vote, the mayor has a very substantial bully pulpit from which to speak. And so we make sure that the mayor's office is informed and the mayor's informed of this process. I explained my reasons for keeping the Corporation Council very much involved in the process, but then finally, most importantly, is the council. I had somebody say to me today that we're an independent body, is somebody on a charter commission. And I said, yes, you are. You can do anything you want. The president of the council has said you have very broad authority. But remember, you need to report this back to the council. We need to report a document back to the council that we believe will be approved by the council and will end up in the ballot. Now, there could from time to time be a dispute on issues. I had this in one of my communities, two of my communities. In one community, the commission took on the council and ultimately persuaded the council in the end, in the last step, that what they were doing made sense. In another community, they did not. And that happens from time to time. Most of the times you try to ameliorate it, negotiate it, and end up in a situation where the final report of the commission will align with a majority view on the city council. So yes, you are independent, but in the end, you are dependent on the legislative body to place this item on the ballot next November. I'll just go through. I won't spend a lot of time on my background, but I've done charters in most of the major cities. The only major city I've not done charter in is Stamford, but I've worked on 3 in New Britain, 4 in Hartford, 2 in Waterbury, 3 in Hamden, 2 in New Haven. Did a major project in Bridgeport. Really, I think the best charter I ever did, but a great example, we'll talk about it, where the mayor, who I had great admiration for, bit off more than he could chew in a battle with the Board of Education against my advice, and the commission against my advice, followed the mayor's lead, and we lost the charter. It was a great revision of a charter. We may have an opportunity to do it again in the near future. Middletown, I just finished with Fairfield on a massive restructuring of their charter. The smaller towns, East Windsor, Portland, Darien, Berlin, and Newtown as well. I worked on a lot of projects throughout the state for most of the major cities in the state, including Stamford in your part of the state, and worked on procurement reform, was counsel to a major procurement revision in the early part of the century, the beginning of the Rell administration, and have worked on major procurement and civil service reforms in a lot of the major cities in the state, including Stamford. Actually, one of my earliest projects as a young lawyer was a structural reform of the personnel system in Stamford, and have represented CCM over the years as outside counsel to the board of directors, and have represented 3 COGs, currently 2, and have done some very interesting reports, forensic analyses for different communities throughout the state of Connecticut. Oh, and that's you. And now I'm here to serve you. and I look forward to the time we're going to spend together. I look forward to spending some time with you in a room. I've done 6 charters in the last 2 years and only met one of my commissions. So I have a feeling things are starting to relax a little bit. So I'll get to meet some of you in person. But I look forward to working on this process, and with the permission of the chair, be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I hope I didn't go through it too quickly. But happy to answer any questions you may have.
It certainly was comprehensive, and you outlined a daunting task and a lot of responsibility that we've stepped up to the plate for. So are there any members of the commission that have a question that they would like to ask council?
Yeah, Steve, first thing, Steve, nice job, nice presentation, setting us on our course for the next 10 months. That Simon versus Canty case, do you have any more information on that we could possibly have? I'd like to take a look at that.
Yeah, I'll get the case over to you. It's, I'll make sure I send it out to you. I was a very young lawyer. I was the first director of the state elections. It's a funny story. I was the first director of the State Elections Commission when I was 22 years old. I worked for Sam Irvin on the Watergate Committee, and Gloria Schaefer hired me to help build the Elections Commission in Connecticut. And after I left that, I went to law school and came out of law school, and I was doing a title search in Watertown, Connecticut. I was down in the vaults in Watertown, Connecticut, and the town clerk saw me and said, "Aren't you the former director of the Elections Commission?" She said, "Yeah." Said, "We have a problem." And the problem was a recall. They were trying to recall an official in Watertown. And she said, "Would you be willing to look at this case?" And I got involved in the case. And that's where I first really learned. I was an elected official. I was an alder at that point for 4 years or 5 years, but I truly didn't understand home rule. A lot of people who serve in local government don't understand home rule, but I learned it in Simons versus Canty, and we turned over all of the recall provisions in the state of Connecticut. And it's a great primer because it will teach you a lot about home rule. A lot of the stuff, you'll see Dylan's rule in there. A lot of the stuff I talked about today go back to that case, but I'll make sure you get a copy of the case.
Well, I think it's appropriate that the town clerk asked you there.
Well, my town clerks were my favorite, and registrars were my favorite people, because as director of the Elections Commission, they were my constituency. So I had a lot of good relationships with town clerks and registrars back in those days. So I'll get it to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Before we proceed, will the record please note that Michael Witherspoon has joined us. Welcome, Michael.
Hello all.
Any other questions? Anybody on Zoom want to raise your hand or chime in? Okay. I think, yes. Oh, yeah, well, it's, I'm sorry, this is not a public hearing. It's not a public hearing, so. We need to really discuss whether every other Wednesday and whether 5 o'clock works for the members of the commission. We had a tight opportunity to begin this, and that's why we picked Wednesday night for several reasons. So who? Oh, I didn't see him here. Mayor Riley? Oh, there you are. Would you like to address us?
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes,
sir.
we can. We can't see you, but
Well,
we.
first of all, I was very impressed with this presentation. Thank you, Steve. Your experience and background speaks for itself. But first and foremost, I really want to thank all of the Charter Revision Commission for your willingness to serve. This is a very challenging, time-consuming process, but it's very, very important to the city of Norwalk and to the council and to me. So I really appreciate, and I want to thank you all for your willingness to serve.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Any other words of wisdom you want to share?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Any other words of wisdom would you like to share?
No, I think the wisdom comes from the Charter Revision Commission, the council, the Corporation Council, and the mayor's office. And I think together we will put together a really good product that will stand the test of time for many years.
Thank you. I'm sure that's the goal of all of the members of the commission. So back to whether or not Wednesday works for everybody and whether a better time on a Wednesday also works. So why don't we start with the people that are here to just make your comments whether it works or not. We do have a conflict for with Yom Kippur on our next potentially scheduled meeting of the October 5th. So that needs to be adjusted for that holiday. Rick, do you have any other comments?
No, I mentioned that to the council president, Mr. Livingston, that I thought out of respect for the Jewish holiday that we
Yeah.
should not hold a public hearing on the day of Yom Kippur. I see no reason if the next Wednesday works for all of us, that we kick it off then. I mean, it will be 3 weeks from now, but I think we have a lot in front of us
Yeah, we do. Yes.
to work here. It'd be a good night to get started and get enough information out to people that we'll be doing the public hearing.
Tyler?
I was just gonna ask, are we gonna plan to do in person and remote throughout, or is that? just
I think we're flexible and I think the season of the flu and COVID is going to dictate to us. There's a lot to be gained either way that you do it, and the combination also is helpful for people who can't get through the traffic at 5 o'clock or 6
I was
o'clock.
gonna say,
Yeah.
childcare might be an issue.
Yeah.
If it's at
Yeah.
home,
Yeah.
maybe from home, that make it work
Uh-huh.
mostly.
So you would prefer a different time?
No, 5 o'clock should work, as long as,
Yeah, that.
if you
Still have
Zoom
some
option,
Yeah.
right, the duration.
Tyler.
Okay, so Carl, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the time is good at 5 o'clock, and I think Wednesdays, once we get past the Jewish holidays, works too, because if you look at, I think, and Rick, you would know this better than I, if you look at other boards and commissions and other meetings that take place during the week, Wednesday seems to be the day that's the most free.
Yes,
Absolutely.
that's why that was one of the major reasons we settled on it. Yes. Okay,
Okay.
that's good. And Michael?
Wednesdays is a good day for me. Time wise, I'm going to say 6 o'clock because sometimes I have meetings scheduled at 5 o'clock.
Uh-huh.
That's what happened today.
Okay, I'm not sure if Benita is still with us. I don't see her.
Yeah, I don't either.
Okay. Okay, so we would now focus on a public.
Steve, you had your hand up?
I do. I was just going to say that 5 o'clock, from a public perspective, and I'll defer to the culture in Norwalk, is whether members of the public will be generally available to observe your meetings at 5 o'clock, and whether a meeting like this, which was organizational and where you have business that you're basically working on things, I will be recommending as we get to the end of the process that we start as early as possible. But during the deliberation process, I'm just wondering whether maybe 6 o'clock makes more sense. And for a public hearing, I just wonder how many members of the public will be available. I'll defer to Tom and others, or the mayor and others locally, because I don't want to tread on a local practice. If 5 o'clock meetings are acceptable, I mean, I just come from in Fairfield, the Board of Selectmen meets at 4 o'clock. So I just don't know what the culture is, but I just wanted to raise that.
I think it's an excellent point. And is there any objection to changing it to 6 o'clock?
No, I actually think that probably is a better time also.
Okay. So that's what, is there anyone not in favor of Wednesdays at 6 o'clock? And the public meeting to be scheduled on October 12th? I'm just looking at, yeah, okay,
So we'll start October 12th and the 2-week cycle will start with the October 12th meeting, Madam Chair.
yes.
Good.
I'd
All right,
like
just
to
want-
take a vote on that proposal. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion carries unanimously. So we have some homework certainly to do. And I don't know if there are any other questions from the members about process. There are hard copies here at City Hall that we will get to those of you who are on the Zoom. And council will be sending us out some additional information soon, correct, Steve?
Yes,
Okay, and also I had copied all the resumes of the members of the commission for each of us to have so that we get to know each other a little better because I don't think we all really have met before. So once again, I want to thank everyone. And is there any other issue or topic that anyone would like to bring up at this time? Okay, so not hearing none, a motion to adjourn is in order.
I'll make a motion for adjournment.
And
Second.
second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye,
Aye.
we are adjourned.
Thank you. Good job.
6:20.
Take care.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you. Have a good night.
bye-bye.
So Jordan, you'll get the hard copies out to. And how quickly do we get minutes?